So we're going to start with the waterfall model. And a lot of people think of this as an outdated model. It was the model that was studied back in the early 90s, and the waterfall model was the model that was being taught. Although the models have evolved, the waterfall model is still in use in some industries. So in the waterfall model, the activities are planned in advance and your progress is measured against this plan. Each phase is separate and distinct. Let's look at the different phases. So the first phase is developing the requirements. And my very first job out of graduating from Stout was at IBM, and we were working on a satellite system. We had a contract with Onizuka Air Force Base, and IBM was responsible for the software. And so there were a lot of different groups involved, and it's also, once you've launched that satellite into space, you really can't very easily or cheaply change the hardware on that. So we had to make sure that the requirements were well defined, and there were two extremely bright and arrogant guys that worked as the primary requirements definition gurus, and they sat down with the customer and the other contracts, and they hashed out exactly what the system was supposed to do, generated huge documents. When they were done, that's when the system design started. And so the system design is a separate, distinct phase. So now we have a very well-defined set of requirements, and now the architecture people and the high-level programmers or software engineers take and make decisions on how the system is going to look, what its architecture, what are the modules that are going to be implemented, how those modules talk to each other, and they come up with this plan. And that plan breaks the functionality into smaller modules. And then those smaller modules then get handed off to the people that are actually going to be writing the code, implementing the code. And back in 91, we really didn't do unit testing yet, but waterfall model has evolved a little bit with the times. And so that implementation and unit testing is that next phase in the waterfall. Once everything is implemented, then you hand that over to a group of people that are responsible for doing the test. And so all those components are put together and you start testing them. And if all those tests pass, then you deliver it to the customer and you're in operation. Now, even when I took this class back in the late 80s, early 90s, these arrows were on here, and these arrows are a little confusing because it makes it look like you can go back and forth. But that's not the waterfall model. The waterfall model is separate and distinct, and you drop down from tier to tier like a waterfall and move forward. Notice how these arrows coming back are really only coming back from operations and maintenance. Now, obviously, if they find some humongous flaw in the middle of implementation and testing, the process could be cut short. But in general, the idea is that you're going through this whole process. Now, the problem with this process is what happens if you find a problem in operation and maintenance. Well, if it's a bug in the code, well, it's still a pretty expensive problem because the customer's already using it, and you have to go back to the implementation and redo all the integration and testing and redeliver the product. But what happens if the error isn't really just a coding bug? What if those really bright guys actually got something wrong? They didn't define the requirements per the user's needs. Well, now we have an extremely expensive proposition, and we have not gotten feedback from the customer. Well, we went back and forth with the customer when we defined the requirements. Maybe that took 6 months, and then 2 years later, we deliver them the product, and it might not be what they want. And so that's why software has evolved. Agile has become popular because Agile adds that feedback into the loop. At the time when I graduated from college, that was when bigger systems were starting to be developed, and people thought that if you really spent the time to figure out what was really needed, then you wouldn't be wasting all this time with change. And that paradigm has really flipped in the software industry, where now people are of the attitude that everything is always changing. So instead of trying to make sure every detail is right, let's consider the fact that details are changing and jump in. So the waterfall is an older style model, but it is still in use today. So here's the text that will help you explain what I talked through. For the use, I would imagine my colleagues back at IBM, who I don't keep in touch with anymore, as too long ago, they probably have somewhat of a water model still in place, because there's not much chance for an increment when your hardware and software will be blasted into space. Now, it's not that you can't. They did send up the shuttle to fix the Hubble telescope, but I mean, that's millions of dollars to fix the bug, right? Fix the problem. So waterfall model can still be useful.